or sigmoidal in fancy terms. The derivative of that growth curve is the average daily gain, the instantaneous rate of change, and there's an inflection point in the growth curve where the curve's going to change in shape from being concave up to concave down. Those things are technical, and we're not going to have a technical class, but I want you to understand that there are aspects of that growth curve that relate to how the animal is behaving too. And so for our purposes right here, right now, let's focus on those X's in the individual lines. And if you think back to, we were talking about some scaling of operations in the first webinar, the optimal or magic number for a sheep operation. There was a point of diminishing returns in that graph too, where growing the flock by additional sheep was not increasing returns or was exceeding resources. In this case, there's a point, it's denoted by those X's, which is a point of maximum returns where the growth of the animal slows down. And at that point, it's most efficient to not keep that animal longer because it becomes a cost liability. And there's also some things at that point that happen physiologically with the animal that are going to be interesting to understand as we move along. Okay, but think of those X's as a target harvest weight for the animal. We'll talk about why that's optimal. When we dig into target live weights, there's a lot of range in the sheep industry. The sheep industry does not produce a commodity. Sheep is a specialty protein. There's a wide range of carcasses that are acceptable, a lot of different scenarios with inputs and breeds and so on and so forth. Typically the range for finished lambs, which are taken to heavy weights and sold on a retail cut basis generally, is from 90 to 150 pounds. That average works out to be about 125 depending on the region, and I would submit that that's probably a little bit high for the local region here, particularly in grass operations, due to the high cost of grain and the cost of overwintering sheep here. That is also combined with this high price opportunity that we have locally for light, or slang term hothouse lamb markets. And I've been on some operations where it simply did not pay to feed those sheep to heavier weights. The greatest point of profitability was pretty much immediately after weaning. And so if we look at that growth curve, there's also some rationale for that, where the point in each of those curves that's encircled in red here is the point where that curve is going through an inflection point. It's changing from concave up to concave down. And after that point, which is, in economic terms, a point of diminishing growth, but that means the growth rate is slowing down. And that might be the greatest profitability point in the entire growth curve, depending on inputs. If there's a market for those types of lambs, sometimes it makes a lot of sense to market them, even if it's as feeders to be finished. We've got to look at those price opportunities. One thing that I can't stress enough in terms of growth, meat quality, and composition is that the most important tool on the farm for evaluating meat quality is a scale. Okay, weight explains a very high percentage of the variation in nearly all the carcass measurements we're going to talk about tonight. And you might not have the resources or the numbers for a chute system, digital scale with an electronic ID reader and all the bells and whistles like pictured here. But get creative. There's no excuses. If you're trying to develop a brand and a quality product, let alone increase profitability and make genetic improvement, the weight of your lambs and having a way to know that information, record that information, and make decisions on that information is essential. So even if it's just a bathroom scale, I've been there holding lambs in my arms and doing some subtraction. You got to know the weights of those lambs to be able to know the rest of what's important. Okay. The next step from live weight is carcass weight. And many times, carcass weight is the pay basis for lambs marketed locally here. Okay. The extreme range in carcass weight is probably 30 to 100 pounds, although I've sold some 26-pound carcasses to New York City. Normal range is certainly narrower than that, 45 to 75 pounds, and that's probably the difference between more grass-based versus more grain-based operations here. And the average is going to be 60 to 65 pounds, depending on region, and I'd submit that that's probably a little bit high, again, for many of the grass operations here locally. Two different pictures, two different scenarios. One on the left is 40-pound carcasses in the Northeast raised on grass. And the picture on the right is actually from Australia, but heavier carcasses, not quite as heavy as the Western US lamb. But the one thing that I want you to notice there are the differences in fat cover and also the consistency of that rail on the right, as we've talked about in the previous presentation. Okay. Those two measurements, carcass weight and live weight, give us an indication of what's called dressing percentage. And you'll hear a lot of people mentioning this as a metric for their success and their meat quality, and that's not all bad. Okay? Carcass weight divided by live weight is dressing percentage. The extreme range is probably 40 to 60%, more normally 45 to 57, and the average is generally right around 52. That's for a shorn lamb. What are the things that influence dressing percentage? Well, the way to think about that is what's on a carcass and what's not. The fleece of a sheep has a weight, but that doesn't end up on the carcass. Okay, the gut fill, and particularly a ruminant that has a lot of capacity to consume a lot of forage, has weight that doesn't get represented in the numerator of that equation. It's not on the carcass. It's certainly part of the live weight. Those two things are going to decrease the dressing percentage as they get heavier. Muscle also drives dressing percentage, and heavier muscled sheep have higher dressing percentages. But the biggest one that a lot of people don't fully realize that drives dressing percentage up is fat. And with that in mind, I'm going to say that while dressing percentage is often a good economic indicator if the operation's paid on carcass weight, it's not a good indicator of carcass yield or quality, because fat to excess is problematic. And that's going to segue us back to composition and thinking about how these various tissues in the body grow. So meat animals are made up of three important tissues, or a meat animal carcass is made up of three important tissues: muscle, fat, and bone. The carcass doesn't have a growth curve, but if you think about those tissues over the life of the live animal, muscle is typically the highest percentage tissue in the body. Bone is, at least after a certain point in growth, the lowest, and bone levels early and stays relatively static. Muscle follows an S-shaped curve, eventually plateaus at maturity, and you see an arrow there, which indicates some physiological maturity. And fat is less predictable. A lot of that depends on nutrition, but if this curve were to continue, muscle and bone would plateau, and fat, in theory, could continue to keep going up and up and up. Obviously, there's an upper limit of that, but a sheep can be made pretty obese with age and nutrition. So understanding that point of physiological maturity is going to become pretty important. And I will define physiological maturity as the point in the animal's growth curve where the tissues are in the optimum percentages to create an optimal yield and quality for the lamb carcass, which means that there's enough fat to drive flavor, but not so much fat to influence cutability. And muscle has increased to the point that it's maximized, but it hasn't been pushed past that point where the weight gain the animal continues to put on is mostly due to fat. Okay, there's some neat mathematical equations for figuring out the point of physiological maturity. And this isn't, dead nuts always right, but it gives you a pretty good indication. And I've gotten one step ahead of myself, so let me backtrack. As an animal deposits fat, that happens in several directions. Okay, there's fat all throughout the body. There's internal fat, fat between muscles, fat outside of muscles, and fat within muscles. And an animal's going to deposit fat from the inside out. So if you see an animal that's fat on the outside, you know the organs, all the internal cavities are going to be loaded with fat. Fat deposits from the front to the rear of the animal and from top to bottom. And so to be able to determine the deposition of those tissues, one of the things that is pretty necessary with sheep, particularly if they have long fleece and the eye is misleading, is to handle those fatty deposits. And that's a hands-on lab that's going to be easier to do when we're not dealing with a pandemic, but being able to physically palpate the difference between fat and muscle gives us an indication of where that animal is in its growth curve and physiological maturity. And if we find an animal that's loaded with fat in the rear and toward the bottom, but even the top of the rear of the animal, so around the tail head, down in the seam of the twist between the legs or the rear flanks, we know that animal is loaded with fat throughout the rest of the body. Okay, physiological maturity, that point where fat becomes optimized in terms of our growth curve and feed efficiency and carcass yield and quality. The target live weight for a market lamb is approximately 64% of the average ewe weight of the parent breeds. That's a little bit confusing terminology, so let me work through an example. Okay, let's go back to our terminal maternal cross that we breed a Suffolk ram to a Dorset ewe. Okay, they each have a weight, but we're not worried about the ram's weight. We're worried about his mother's weight. Okay, the ewe weight of those two breeds. So let's say the Suffolk ram's mother weighed 200 pounds, the Dorset ewe and her mother weigh 150. The average of those two ewe weights is 175 pounds. And 64% of 175 is 110 pounds. That means that Suffolk and a Dorset of this size, 200 and 150 pound ewe weights, would combine to produce 110 pound live lamb in terms of optimal physiological maturity. I challenge you to do some weighing and see where you are with your target carcass weights relative to your ewe flocks, because there's a lot of opportunity for inefficiency here if we're marketing lambs too early or we're trying to get them too heavy relative to what their parental breeds are capable of. Okay, this is not a hard and fast rule, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. And of course, physiological maturity is driven by fat. Now, this is a live weight equation. There's also an alternative way to look at this, and you can thank me for this later. You won't find this published anywhere, but the math works out pretty handy, because if we look at the target carcass weight of a lamb, and oftentimes we talk about our carcass weights, the target carcass weight is generally 1/3 of the average of the ewe weights. That's live ewe weights of the parent breeds. Why is it 1/3? Well, the 64% we talked about before, multiplied by a 52% average dressing percentage, 64% times 52% is 33 1/3. Okay, so that means if we have a target carcass weight of 40 pounds, we're looking for an average ewe weight of the two parent breeds, which may be different or they could be the same, depending on our system, of 120 pounds. all the way up to 75-pound carcass weight, 225 pounds. And I'll let you do the math on the individual examples here, but this helps you understand or gives some quantification to whether your system is in alignment relative to what you're using and what you're trying to produce a lamb that's going to be in an optimal point of physiological maturity in terms of both its feed efficiency and its carcass merit. Okay, so we focused a lot on weights, but lamb quality is certainly a lot more than weight. Said in the beginning, lamb quality is defined by the consumer. You know, what does a consumer want to eat and what would they like to purchase? Okay, and so there's a lot of indicators or attributes of those decisions. Thinking about a pleasurable eating experience, they want a product that's tender, juicy, flavorful. In terms of purchasing decisions, they're looking for a value, which might be attributes of quality relative to price, or it might have something to do with the production protocol of how that lamb was raised, grass-fed, organic, etc. Or that value equation could just be a matter of how much of what is purchased is actually edible versus wasted. Okay. But the most important thing, as I've said before, with lamb quality in terms of customer satisfaction is going to be consistency, because without consistency, it's very difficult to build a brand. It's very difficult to build customer loyalty. And it's very difficult to build any sort of industry to outgrow this small, segmented niche markets that tend to often be very saturated. Okay, so consistency is going to be very important moving forward. And I've used this equation many times, but that consistency and quality is a combination of genetics, or combination of variation in genetics and the environment necessary for building a brand. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're trying to make commodity lamb industry in Vermont. Let's not kid ourselves on the supply side here, but it means that we need to have standards for the indicators of the attributes that a customer is going to demand. And we're going to focus on indicators and attributes moving forward in terms of carcass measurements and grades. The USDA has a grading system. It's quality grade and yield grade. There are not USDA graders in lamb slaughter facilities in Vermont, and it's not likely that there will be. I still think that it's important that you understand how these grades work, because the concepts that go into making those grades and that uniformity of objective selection criteria still matter. Okay. Quality grade is determined as an indicator of a pleasurable eating experience: tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. There are 4 quality grades in lambs: prime, choice, good, and utility. And most of what we see falls into the first 2 categories, as a matter of fact. There occasionally are some good grade lambs. They're not very good. Probably was a little bit of a progressive naming situation there with good grade lambs. Most lambs are prime and choice. Okay, there's also yield grades in USDA, and the attributes that are measured by a yield grade are the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, or you'll see BCTRC as an abbreviation, that come from a carcass. There are 5 numeric yield grades, 1 through 5, and the lower numerical yield grade, so the closer to 1, the higher the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts. The higher the numerical yield grade, the lower the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cut. And that yield equation, of course, is going to indicate profit for the producer and waste reduction for the consumer. The attributes of lamb evaluation that are important, whether we're evaluating live lambs or carcasses, trimness, muscle, and quality, and finding individuals that combine those three things effectively, where oftentimes there's some antagonisms. Trimness certainly is a reduction in fat. Quality and eating quality many times is an increase of the right kinds of fat. And muscling's in the middle and has some bearing on both of the others, but not specifically on the USDA grades. USDA yield grade is driven by trimness, does not include muscling. If you're familiar with yield grading in beef cattle, there are muscle adjustments in that yield grade equation, not in sheep. Okay, and quality grade is determination of quality. The purpose of that grading system is to give some standardization to products so we can get an indication of what they're going to taste like, how they're going to yield. Quality grade, attributes, tenderness, juiciness, and flavor, and the indicators are going to be age of the animal and fat. Age is one of the biggest drivers of tenderness, and as animals get older, they get tougher. That's just muscle biology. Flavor does intensify with age, and sometimes that's preferable, sometimes it's not, but we've got grading systems to account for that. Indicators of quality grade are age and fat. Indicators of yield grade that indicate the attribute of percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, yield grade is driven exclusively by fat. Okay, quality grading is a combination of three things. There's maturity, which is a proxy for age. In a lamb carcass, we don't have the ability to assess its age, but we can assess its maturity, and I'm going to show you how. We can assess its flank streaking, which you probably are not familiar with, but you will be by the end of this. And we can assess its conformation. And the grid that's shown here, matrix of degrees of flank streaking and maturity classes, give rise to the 4 young or older lamb quality grade classes that we talked about: prime, good, or prime, choice, good, and utility. Okay, but let's dig into them a little bit further. So maturity is the best proxy for age in a carcass. Okay, in a sheep, we can use its teeth. We can use dentition to assess its age because they get a pair of new permanent incisors every year. Lamb carcasses don't have a head, and so it's difficult to evaluate dentition and keep that tracked throughout the line. But as an animal gets older, cartilage in its body, the joints, and connective tissue, many of those ossify or turn to bone over the course of their lifetime. And one of them that's handy for evaluating maturity, happens right around a year, is on the foretrotter, which is the cannon bone of the front leg. And whether that breaks in a break joint, which is shown on the top right on the left-hand side, the 2 separate pieces, or if those 2 pieces have ossified together and the joint breaks at a spool joint, which looks like the round end of a spool, that's a determination of whether that lamb or whether that carcass is classified as lamb or as mutton, which is carcass definition for sheep older than a year old. Okay. There's also some color grading, which is evaluated in the colors of the flanks inside the carcass. Lambs are bright, light colored. Mutton carcasses are darker. Whole spectrum of that we're not going to get into. And you also can look at the color and the shape of the ribs. Lamb ribs are red and round. In an older mutton carcass, the rib bones are white and they're flat. Okay, the biggest difference for maturity is the difference between a break joint and a spool joint, and those are pictured at the bottom right for you, carcass level. Okay, flank streaking. Flank streaking is in the rear flanks of the animal inside the carcass. It's an estimate of eating quality, tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. It seems like kind of a random place to measure sheep, but there's some rationale for that. Flank streaking is associated with marbling. Okay, marbling is intramuscular fat within the muscle of the loini. You're probably very familiar with that in a beef context, but sheep have marbling too. It's less variable and less pronounced. But flank streaking is also intramuscular fat, which can be evaluated from the outside of a carcass, and it's associated with marbling inside the high value muscles. Okay, convenient or inconveniently, for measuring marbling, lamb carcasses are not typically ribbed open, cut open between the 12th and 13th rib in a lamb plant by the time they go to grading. And so flank streaking is used to evaluate quality grade. Now, those two factors, maturity and flank streaking, combined give a preliminary quality grade, and that quality grade can be adjusted based on a third classification we mentioned before, which is conformation. Okay, conformation is simply a description of shape, and meat animal shape is difficult to describe, but when you see the differences from left to right in terms of a shapely, heavier muscled carcass on the left, it's grade prime conformation, all the way to the right of a good grade lamb, there is more meat animal shape on the left. Okay, conformation can also be described as width relative to length, and a longer, narrower carcass has a lower conformation score. Okay, conformation can be influenced by both muscle and fat. Normal range is a little bit farther to the right of what's shown here, but high prime to low good. Average low choice right in the center of this picture, and most lambs end up grading prime and choice, but their conformation scores have potential to pull them down. Okay, those are assessments of quality grade, but we've also got some cutability measures that factor into yield grade. Lambs are ribbed between the 12th and 13th rib. They have 13 ribs, and that location is the break between the wholesale rack, primal cut, and the wholesale loin. For that reason, fat thickness, back fat thickness, is measured between the 12th and 13th rib, typically over the 12th rib, because that's what's hanging closer to the ground, or when the lamb is hung by its rear legs. That fat thickness is measured at the center of the loin muscle, as shown the bottom image. There's an arrow on the right-hand side, the midpoint of that loin muscle, showing the back fat thickness, which is the distance from the outer surface to the edge of the muscle. There can be quite a range in back fat thickness, but typically average is about 1/4 of an inch. That's a pretty low magnitude measure that's not highly variable. It's variable, but not highly variable. And so 12th rib fat thickness can be adjusted based on body wall thickness. Body wall is also shown here, 5 inches from the spinal column on that same side. Total tissue thickness, and there's a wider range, greater magnitude, thus a little bit easier to do some working with statistically. Average is about 8/10 of an inch, and a lamb that has more body wall thickness than its back fat thickness might indicate would have its back fat thickness adjusted upward to reflect more accurately the total fat on the body. little bit of a complicated concept, but it all comes down to subcutaneous or surface fat thickness, which is a highly statistically significant indicator of the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts that come from a carcass. But we also have a muscle measure, and in a carcass, specifically relative to high value middle meat cuts like rib and loin chops, the area of that longissimus dorsi muscle or loin muscle between the 12th and 13th rib can be measured. In this case, being done with a dot grid, counting the number of dots, dividing by a divisor, and that gives a two-dimensional area in square inches. Range of that might be from all the way down to 1 to 4 inches on a typical carcass-sized lamb. Average is going to be generally slightly below a 3. But from experience, this measure can be all over the place, and there's a lot of opportunity to improve muscling in sheep by focusing on loin-eye area. Again, there are other muscles in the sheep's body, but loin-eye area tends to be predictive of total muscle mass, and also, like I said, is a measure of muscle size where the highest value cuts are located on the body. Okay, so yield grading is an indicator of the percentage of closely trimmed, boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts that come from the carcass. The equation for lamb yield grading is very simple, and that takes the adjusted 12th rib fat thickness in inches, which could be adjusted for body wall thickness, but might be, we mentioned an average of 1/4 of an inch, 0.25 times 10 plus 0.4. So 0.25 times 10 is 2.5 plus 0.4. The yield grade would be 2.9. Let's work through a couple more examples. Okay, if a lamb has a fat thickness of 0.15 of an inch and a ribeye area of 3.4 square inches, we look at this lamb, looks like a very trim lamb, expressive muscle, there's a lot of shape there, and we look at the cross section, we see a lot of red meat, not a lot of wasty fat. We would expect this to be a high yielding lamb, and it is. Okay, 0.15 times 10 is 1.5 plus 0.4 is yield grade 1.9. That falls into the category of yield grade 1. That's the highest yielding yield grade there is. The other end of the spectrum, this lamb has 0.45 of an inch. Look at the cross section, we see a lot more white than red, particularly down in the body wall. Ribeye area is smaller. And when we look at the outline of the carcass, the widest part of that carcass is in the center. Lamb carcass that's shaped like a canoe is not muscular. We want to see muscle shape on the hindquarters especially, but also in the forequarters. And when we see width in the center of the animal, that's typically driven by fat, not by muscle. Okay, the yield grade for this lamb, 0.45 of an inch of adjusted back fat thickness, times 10 is 4.5, plus 0.4 is yield grade 4.9. Just barely squeaked into yield grade 4 instead of becoming a 5, but it's almost there. And there'd be some evaluators, myself included, who might adjust that lamb into the 46 hundredths of an inch category just to get it into a yield grade 5, because this is a wasty, low yielding lamb. Lamb evaluation is important for lamb valuation and pricing. Traditional markets and commodity lambs are priced based on yield grade, okay, because quality grade is generally pretty similar. Most lambs grade prime and choice, and yield grade is an indicator of what's going to be profitable for the packer in terms of the waste that comes off of those primal, subprimal cuts, and then also what the consumer is going to be interested in buying and based on how much they would have to throw away. Okay. That's the commodity level. Lamb value is influenced by conformation in the graded live lamb markets that we deal with here in the East. And that's going to drive not just those graded markets, but pricing across the board for lambs to be competitive. And so conformation becomes more important in some ways in this part of the world than it does in the commodity world with the current grading system. Now, muscle is not included in yield grade. Okay, yield grade is only a factor of back fat thickness, but muscle does influence conformation, so it is going to influence price in many of our local markets, and it also affects dressing percentage. And a lamb that's purchased on a live weight basis and sold on a carcass weight basis is going to be more profitable if it has a higher dressing percentage. So do not underestimate the value of muscle just because it's not included in the yield grade equation, because it is important, particularly in this part of the world, in other factors that influence price. And like I mentioned, high percentage of U.S. grade lambs grade prime or choice. Quality grade is generally not a strong screening mechanism, except for really exceptional cases when it comes to pricing. All right, so those are the grading systems, indicators, and attributes. But let's tie this back to breeding decisions that we need to make in our flock. We talked last week about the basic equation: phenotype is equal to genotype plus environment. Genotype includes additive genetics and gene combination values. Heritability is the proportion of those additive genetics or additive variants over the phenotypic variants. What proportion of what we see is attributable to genes that are passed from one generation to the next. And heterosis was one example that I gave last week. Heterosis being hybrid vigor, one example of a gene combination value. Okay, we talked about a suite of categories of traits from survival to carcass. Focus on carcass here on the right-hand side, and carcass traits are highly heritable. However, their response to heterosis is low. And that should suggest some implications for how to improve carcass traits in a selection and breeding program. Having a high heritability, they're going to have a high response to selection. Having a low response to heterosis, they're going to have a low response to crossbreeding. And if you don't take my word for it, here's some literature from the Sheep Production Handbook that I've been recommending that you read. Heritabilities for carcass traits, shown here with the exception of dressing percentage, which is variable for a lot of reasons that you could probably guess between wool and gut fill and so forth. Carcass traits range from 30 to 45% heritable, or at least those listed here. Okay, as heritabilities go, those are relatively high. Heterosis values, however, and we talked about an 18% increase in weight of lamb weaned per ewe exposed simply from that lamb being crossbred. The proportion of that that's attributable to carcass traits is approximately 0. Okay, there is not going to be a significant advantage gained in carcass traits from heterosis or from crossbreeding. And so we think about how to make change in a breeding program. We need to use sires that have been highly selected for carcass traits and that will pass that additive genetic value for those carcass traits onto their offspring. Now, there's ways to select for these traits. We can use carcass data, go into the cooler, take measurements. Okay, but that's pretty difficult for an animal that we want to use for reproduction because they don't tend to reproduce very well after they've had their head removed. So many times for carcass data, we evaluate progeny testing. This sire produced a group of lambs whose average back fat thickness was this, or whose average loin eye size was this, compared to this other sire whose progeny averaged this and this, and make comparison between the two. There's a lot of things we need to standardize in that to make it a fair comparison, but progeny testing is evaluating carcass data on the offspring of a live animal. Another way to do that also allows us to get information on the live animal is with ultrasound scanning, where I've done a lot of work over the course of my career. Measurements taken in potential replacement ram lambs or potential replacement ewe lambs. And this is an image from an ultrasound machine. Hopefully you can recognize as a lamb chop. Happens to be a rib chop, where we can see the bright echo of back fat thickness at the top of the image and the darker loin muscle, an oval shape in the center. Measure those, interpret those, and I have essentially carcass data on a live animal that I can still use for reproduction. And that's pretty handy in a breeding program, particularly when selection is highly important. Anytime we take these data, we need to make sure that we adjust them properly to a constant endpoint that allows us to compare apples to apples. That endpoint might be a constant age, or it might be a constant weight. There's a whole long discussion we could get into about adjustment strategies, but one thing I will say with that is that if we're going to compare carcass data, we just need to make sure that it's fairly adjusted. All those things considered, when we're focusing on selection for carcass traits, estimated breeding values are the most accurate indicators of those traits because they account for the environmental variation that goes into those traits. Even though they are highly heritable, even though carcass traits are highly heritable, there's still an environmental component. Estimated breeding values use statistics, records on other traits, records on all the other relatives in the database to estimate the additive genetic value for a specific trait. And on the carcass side, eye muscle depth is a proxy for eye muscle area. Now that's loin eye, not ocular eye, but depth and area are closely related. And back fat thickness. And those would be the two carcass EBVs that I'd recommend evaluating for a breeding program if we were looking for a sire to contribute additive genetics for carcass merit to a breeding program. And finally, we want to talk about evaluating market readiness. Now, hopefully, after this presentation, you can understand why the point that a lamb is ready for market is more sophisticated than simply when my calendar appointment is with the slaughterhouse. Now, I fully recognize that processing appointments are a challenge here locally, particularly with COVID. Okay, but timing harvest is a key component to developing any sort of quality, consistent product, brand, or industry. And when we're trying to target that harvest date, a target weight, I would say, is an absolute minimum. You need to have a scale. That weight is going to explain a lot of variation in the other traits. Next, an optimal degree of finish, which is mostly driven by fat, and also targeting that lamb at a point where its conformation is optimal to produce a quality product. Okay, and without getting into a long discussion about evaluation, hopefully you can look at the third animal from the left, the presentation here, and see that that animal is not market ready compared to others. It lacks both finish and muscle driving conformation. Okay. Even with the challenges with timing processing, there might be opportunities for investment in vertical integration between the producer level and the slaughter level. That, of course, is expensive. Owning slaughter plants is expensive, and the bottom line of a slaughter plant depends pretty heavily on throughput, on supply, particularly in the off season. Now, is there going to be enough product that can move through there in the winter and early spring to keep the operation viable? Okay. And maybe that's a matter of pooling resources among producers and controlling the supply side so that collectively can make sure that there are always lambs available from somebody in a cooperative system all throughout the year. Now, many cooperative systems have failed because of politics, and I will submit that if we can move the dialogue more toward these objective measures of carcass yield and quality that I've described here today, there then is an objective basis for making decisions of whose lambs go, what week, and what they're paid. And that takes a lot of the politics out of those systems that in the past have doomed them to fail. Okay, we could go on about this for a long time, but we've reached the end of our time. I'm going to wrap it up with that. I would strongly recommend, again, the Sheep Production Handbook. Great resource for total sheep production resource, but also the American Meat Science Association has the Meat Evaluation Handbook. Lamb section is short, sweet, and to the point, but there's good information there on lamb as well as other species. That's the third of three. I really appreciate everyone tuning in for these. And I welcome any questions that you have on anything. See if I can find our chat box here. There we go. Okay, question about back fat thickness, measurement through ultrasound. When is it recommended to use? And so certainly there are two levels for using ultrasound measurements. One is to determine which lambs are ready for market and when, and the other is which lambs are suitable for breeding. And so those two uses are going to have some bearing on when that measurement is used. But let's turn this question around. When is the best time to take that measurement? And NSIP adjusts back fat thickness to a constant weight, but that weight is taken in correspondence with the post-weaning weight, which is generally around 120 days or 4 months of age. I think it can be as little as 3 months and as many as 5 months. But at 4 months, the lamb is mature enough that its back fat thickness is indicative of what its back fat thickness would be at a range of typical slaughter weights. Okay, so scanning somewhere around 4 months for both meat lambs and potential breeding stock is suitable. If we have access to an ultrasound machine, opportunity to scan them more frequently, we could do it on a weekly basis. Scan a pen of lambs and figure out which ones are optimal. But certainly that requires access to the equipment. Question on the 95% of U.S. lambs grading prime and choice. Is that statistic based on only lambs actually graded? And the answer to that is yes. There's no assumption of any grading on states like Vermont where there's not grading. So that's simply lambs that are stamped. Obviously, there's some error in that, and we can make some suppositions one way or the other as far as how that might change. But one thing that I will say is that many of the lambs in Vermont or in New England or in the Northeast fit sort of non-traditional carcass weights that don't necessarily fit into the commodity grading system anyway. The quality grading system for commodity lamb is pretty loose, and frankly, that's unlikely to change unless, and we're starting to see this, there's more focus on instrument grading or image-based grading that's mechanized as opposed to subjective grading from an inspector or a grader. And so as those industry lines become more dependent on imaging technology, we might see a shift in the grading system or grading classifications, and thus a shift in the percentages. I better catch up with some of these other questions. Okay, talk a bit more about how to improve taste through management practices for grass-fed sheep. So one big thing that comes into play there is not all grass is created equal. And certainly the energy content of a forage is going to influence how a lamb grows. It's going to influence how it deposits fat. And just like, in many cases in human nutrition, forage that's higher in sugar, higher on a Brix refractometer measurement, is going to have higher energy content, be more conducive to fat deposition, and also be sweeter. And that taste does come through in some cases in meat. Now, forage quality tends to influence the flavor of fat. Okay, fat drives the taste of lamb more so than the taste of the lean itself. And so we can get into a long discussion here, but there are differences, in color of fat, for example, between a grain-fed versus a grass-fed animal, and grass-fed fat is more yellow than grain-fed because of the beta carotene and the starch content and so on and so forth. But many of the nutrient profiles that we're interested in, the fatty acids of the meat, originate, at least in basic form, from the forages themselves. The other thing, as far as influencing taste, is managing the other aspects of quality. Okay, fat was one of them, and flank streaking, but the other is maturity. And maturity showed in the composition change slide. Maturity influences the deposition of fat. Animals get fatter as they get older, but maturity also influences the texture and the composition of the lean or of the muscle. As an animal gets older, the muscle gets tougher. And while that might not influence taste in the traditional sense, it's certainly going to influence an eating experience where most often a person would prefer a more tender product coming from a younger animal. Now, there's also antagonisms with that. And flavors are going to intensify as an animal gets older. Sometimes that's desirable in some cultures, other times it's not. And so we need to know who we're marketing to and what the preferences are for. But sometimes extremely young lamb that's very tender is not preferred because it is more mild. Okay, so understanding the audience becomes very important in knowing how to manage those grass-fed sheep and those forages for eating quality. We could spend a lot of time on that, but that's the answer to that in a nutshell. Explain heritability for carcass with heterosis in a crossbred versus purebred. Not sure understood the point. All right, so heterosis can occur in purebreds if those purebreds are from strains that are relatively less related to each other. Heterosis just means that the genes that combine are different. They're not related by a common ancestor. Okay, but as I mentioned in the last slide, heritability or heterosis, hybrid vigor, is the most powerful tool in animal breeding for the most economically important traits. But the most economically important traits tend to be the lower heritability traits, such as fitness and reproduction. Okay, and so where crossbreeding is a valuable tool for improving those traits, crossbreeding is a less valuable tool for improving carcass traits in a crossbred system, because those traits are more heritable, thus they're more driven by additive genetics, thus they're more driven by selection than by crossbreeding. Okay, and so if we need to bring in new blood in a crossbred or a purebred system, doesn't matter, just the act of that being a new breeding animal, an unrelated breeding animal, is going to give a boost to fitness and reproduction traits. But it's not going to give a boost to carcass traits just because it's different. It's only going to give a boost to carcass traits if the additive genetics, the heritable part of those carcass traits, is superior. And it's only going to be superior if it's been selected accurately to be superior. Hope that clears that up. Can a farmer or rancher discuss self-graded quality with customers without running afoul of USDA rules? Of course. They're, they're not, the lambs are not going to have a USDA stamp. It's not going to be an official USDA grade. And in some cases, I would submit that the USDA grades aren't necessarily indicative, or as indicative as some of the individual measures that go into making. But a farmer or rancher could certainly go into a cooler and take back fat thickness measurements, take loin eye size measurements, and give ballparks of where those would fall based on a USDA grading system, have that conversation with a customer, whether it's a direct consumer customer or a wholesale buyer. And I think that's going to add a lot of value to the discussion, because it shifts toward the focus on the attributes of the product, as opposed to more on romance and storytelling. And it's going to be or it's going to contribute to consistency, which I think is the big way that we can scale and improve the lamb industry specifically in this area. And I didn't try to make that a segue into the next question, but I guess it is. The best way to achieve improved uniformity in the lamb industry. All right, so that's all going to start with the market. What does the market want? Do we have wholesale buyers that have a specific range of chefs or clients that they distribute to that has specific specifications? Start with those specifications. Typically it's a target carcass weight, target carcass fat thickness, and muscle size. Okay, commodity level gets to quality and yield grade. If we're not there, that's fine. But those attributes are where to start. Then work backward. So these are the attributes that we want. Biggest one is weight. Weight explains a lot of that variation. Use the size scaling rules that I talked about in terms of picking the breeds that are going to be at the optimal point in physiological maturity at that size. And then evaluate those breeds. Do they work for the system that we have or the resources that we have? Now, one of the biggest challenges in the lamb industry in New England is that many of the operations are small. Many of the operations have different breeds or different types of animals from each other, and even within their own system, there's a lot of different diversity in breeds and sizes and shapes. In some ways that ensures that every lamb has a home, but if we want to scale into more wholesale markets that can carry some branding with them, it's going to be important to focus that. And that means there's going to have to be cooperative groups that agree on a narrower range of breeds, a narrower range of genetics within those breeds to achieve the desired goal. That system could be throughout the year, and that's going to have some variation based on what's needed, different times, so on and so forth. But I think that the best way to achieve improved uniformity, there's two of them. Number one, focus on objective measurements. And number two, focus on collaborations. Because no one is going to be able to supply all the demand that we've got for lamb in this region on their own. But together, if we're smart about it, and if we're fair and objective about it, there are ways to pool producers together to hit those markets. Any other questions? All right, going to wrap it up with that. Thank you all very much for your time. And these recordings will be available. They'll be distributed when the links are ready via the announcements with Eventbrite. And more than likely, they'll be posted on the VSGA website. If anyone has any questions that come up at any time, feel free to contact me. My information is here, and I welcome your inquiries. Thanks again, and everyone have a good night.